All right, welcome in to the Addison to 35th podcast, your Chicago baseball podcast. This is going to be the first Cubs-focused, Cubs-centric episode, and I'm happy to welcome on my good friend, Jared Wyllys. Jared Wyllys writes for both Cubs and Sox for CHGO. I've known him since, 2021, MLB.com days and all that stuff, and you've been able to read Jared's work in a bunch of different outlets. But Jared, thanks for hopping on, man.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk some Cubs.
Yeah, as we all are, always. So just for clarity's sake, we're recording this Thursday, March 6th here at night, right around the time the Cubs are starting facing the Royals. So maybe we'll have hopefully everything we talk about today doesn't get outdated by tomorrow morning when this show is probably going to go out. But I guess we'll see what happens. I know the reports out of camp today were Justin Steele being scratched with flu-like symptoms, so nothing really to be worried about. Ben Brown taking his place, starting that game against the Royals. But I mean, Jared, you were there this last week, and you went down to Mesa. You had a few days there at Cubs camp.
Yeah.
I'm curious, just kind of what was your take on what the vibes at Cubs camp and some of the news that came out, and where we're kind of looking at the Cubs right now, about halfway through spring training.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, the feeling there was definitely, the vibes were good. It's probably the simplest way to put it, because I think there's a lot of guys there who are excited about some of the new additions, some of the veteran players that they've brought in. That was a lot of the talk. I think Justin Turner has really put a jolt in a lot of the guys. Just having somebody like him there, with the experience that he has, and not just the experience that he has, but what he's been through as a player. Because he, at one point, we talked about he's gone through every possible thing that a guy can do, like being released, being DFA'd, thinking your career is over, and then getting it revived, being in a World Series team. He's done all of that stuff. And so in a way, there's almost nothing that anybody on that team could go through that Justin Turner can't offer some wisdom on. So, and on top of that, he's just an absolute hitting junkie. I mean, he hangs around the cages. He's always talking to guys about hitting. So that's generated, I think, a lot of energy and excitement. But then otherwise, this Japan series, I know we're going to talk about that, but there's a lot of just, they're figuring out who's going to go, what roles they're going to play, how that impacts their normal spring preparations, because they got to camp earlier, and they, the way that they're ramping up certain guys gets altered because of the Tokyo series. But yeah, overall, it was a very positive energy there. Guys feeling good about things in these early stages.
Yeah, which is never it feels like that's never not the case. I feel like everyone's in the best shape of their life in spring training and feeling really good about the season, feeling really good about their chances. But no, I mean, there is this air, I think, around this team that, you added Kyle Tucker. Kyle Tucker is obviously the big signing, or the big trade, the big addition of the offseason, the guy that you're setting and forgetting in the middle of your order or near the top of the order, and can help carry your team through some offensive dry spell. That's what the Cubs didn't have last season. But you're talking about Ryan Presley's in there. You mentioned Justin Turner. They've added a bunch of veteran guys, a bunch of guys with postseason World Series experience. I mean, I'm curious, comparing kind of what the Cubs bench or bullpen or back end of the rotation was in the last couple of years, the 83-win seasons, versus what they do have now. Justin Turner is going to be. He's not going to be an everyday 600 plate appearance guy. He's going to be, filling in at first base, DHing, maybe in an emergency situation he plays third base, but he's going to be counted on as more of a bench or a role player bench guy. And you got, like I mentioned, Ryan Presley being added there in the bullpen and guys like that. Just how do you kind of compare what the Cubs are going into 2025 with in those more marginal areas of the roster versus what they've had in the last couple of years?
Well, I think in that way, they're definitely on paper at least, a lot stronger going into this season. We've seen covering this team the last couple of years, where sometimes that lack of depth is a big part of what cost them. I think we saw a lot of that last season with the bullpen, where when either it was guys underperforming or guys just getting injured and not being able to pitch, where they just didn't have somebody to fill certain roles in the bullpen. And then they're blowing a lot of games. And they're a team that was, I think, expected to do better than 83 wins last year. Struggled even to get to that point. So this season with Ryan Presley there, I think that solidifies the end of that bullpen and like allows Craig Counsell to kind of work backwards from there, which is what you want to be able to do. And in adding some of these veteran arms like Brazier, like Colin Ray, and some of these, Eli Morgan, some of these other guys that they brought in, which creates a lot more depth. Jack Neely's another one who I know he just got optioned to AAA a few days ago, but he's going to be up at some point. Yeah. That makes a big difference too, along with some of the younger guys that are from their system. Like, we saw toward the end of last season what Porter Hodge was able to do, saving some games in September and looking, pretty good doing it. Luke Little's getting healthy. I saw him throw, a 1-inning sim game on the backfields on Saturday. So depth-wise in those areas of the team, I think they're a lot stronger, and that can be the difference between, 83 wins and 88 wins or 89, maybe even touching 90.
Yeah. And I think one of the words you used was depth. And you look at the bullpen, I think obviously it feels like there's more depth there. It feels like in the rotation, Matthew Boyd, you mentioned Colin Ray, add some depth to that rotation along with some of the other guys in camp. And in the outfield, last season, Mike Tauchman was the Cubs' fourth outfielder. You didn't really know what you were getting from Owen Casey or Kevin Alcantara, which you didn't get anything from them just because, or I guess Alcantara debuted at the end of the last season, but they didn't get to the big league team to help there. But this season, you're talking about Seiya Suzuki as the Cubs' fourth outfielder on the major league roster. You have Kevin Alcantara and Owen Casey as the Cubs' fifth and sixth outfielders. You got some depth behind them. That feels like a spot that when you talk about depth that feels like the Cubs' strongest, most depth positive spot on the roster.
Yeah, and I think way more so than they've had for the last couple of years. Because that's a really good point. Seiya Suzuki is your fourth outfielder, which I know his defense has been a little bit of a letdown, but if that's your fourth outfielder option, that's pretty dang good. So if you need to put him in right field for a game to get Kyle Tucker off his feet, or even he's had some looks in center field this spring, putting him there if need be, that's pretty nice. And then given the guys that you mentioned where you have some in-house options, or at least within the organization options like Casey and Alcantara, where that can be your number 5 and 6 options. That's again, that's the depth that they really haven't had for the last couple of years. Yeah.
And as far as spring training or catching up on camp goes, notes from what we've got in the first few weeks of camp. When you were down there was the big Matt Shaw update, dealing with an oblique injury at the beginning of spring training, was limited, wasn't participating in games at the start and drills and that kind of stuff. Finally got into his first spring training game, Cactus League game on Sunday. I believe he played again on Tuesday. Got a couple hits there. What are we feeling? What's the feeling like? What did you hear about Matt Shaw at camp? About it feels like by domestic opening day, that feels good that he's going to be on the roster if that's the route the Cubs choose. What about Japan? He's not on the 40-man roster, so they obviously have to make a decision there. Japan, it's still kind of a tight window as far as him first just beginning Cactus League games to being able to play in a regular season baseball game. Just what is your kind of feeling there as far as is he going to be ready to play in Japan for the Cubs?
Honestly, I think Japan would be kind of pushing it a little bit because they leave on the 11th. So as we're recording that's 5 days from now. So he at this point has only played a couple of spring games, and he's not even playing full games yet because that always takes a little while. Counsell told us before his game on Sunday that we're going to play them every other day for a little bit because that's kind of the normal early spring ramp up schedule that you follow where you don't have them on the field every day. So I think, domestic opening day, no problem. He'll be ready. I honestly would be surprised if they took him to Japan. I think they're better off to keep him, here in the U.S. and Arizona, let him play in like some minor league games, continue to get those reps and those at bats, and focus on getting ready for the 27th because that's kind of what they're doing with Nico Hoerner.
Yeah.
He's on the same kind of program, and I know it's disappointing like for these guys because what a cool opportunity to get to go there and play, but the council talked about like I'd rather have those guys for 160 games compared to just these two. So because in the grand scheme of things, it's just 2 games out of the whole season, and it may not be worth it.
Yeah, no, and I that makes sense. Like it is an experience, and like they're going out for like a week or so, getting to experience Japan, Tokyo. I'm sure some of those guys have never been to even Asia, but let alone Japan or Tokyo. It's a cool experience. Like it's probably bigger, honestly, than the Field of Dreams game a couple of years ago. Like that was a cool thing, getting to play, in Iowa, in the cornfield, small atmosphere like that. Like a lot of guys were really happy that they got to have that experience. I'm sure for guys like Nico, you mentioned Nico's not making the trip, and Matt Shaw potentially, may not be there either. I'm sure that'll be disappointing, but like you said, council wants those guys. Like I think everyone wants those guys for 160 games versus just those two, if that's what it takes. But that, that kind of leads us into our second little segment or talking point is our Tokyo roster projections. We're getting close there. Their first game is on the 18th of March. So we're right now 12 days away. Regular season baseball is coming up, and obviously that brings with it roster projections. You mentioned Nico Hoerner is not going to be there. So that's second base is open. Matt Shaw potentially might not be ready to play by then. You're looking at the outfield is set, Hap, PCA, Kyle Tucker, barring obviously injuries or anything like that. You got Suzuki at DH, Dansby at shortstop, Michael Busch at first base, and then the Amaya Carson Kelly tandem at catcher. At least I think that's my feeling, but that feels pretty obvious at this point. That's the positions that are set. Second and third are open. How do you feel about the guys they have in camp right now, and who might be going with the Cubs to Japan and actually taking those positions if they're both open?
So the two probably obvious choices are John Birdie and Vidal Brujan. But I know this is somebody that a lot of Cubs fans have kind of had their eye on this spring is Gage Workman. Right. They got him in the Rule 5 draft from Detroit. He's had a nice spring, like he's been hitting really well. But then there's a couple of questions with him. I don't think he's played above Double-A. And if you do decide to keep him, like you're committing to, you've got this guy in your 26-man roster. Otherwise, Rule 5, he's got to go back to Detroit. So committing to like putting him on the roster as your third baseman that's kind of a big thing, which is part of why I tend to think they're going to go maybe the safe route, and you're taking Birdie and Brujan to Japan. If nothing else, than to give them more opportunities to get a look at Workman so that they can make a more like long-term decision about what they want to do with him. Because they expect to have both Hoerner and Shaw back by the 27th when they open the season in the United States. So Workman's somebody we should all have our eye on, but I don't expect him to be a part of that Japan roster either. Yeah,
I mean, that's such a weird thing. Like I don't think even the people in the know are totally clear on the rules of like how that affects the roster.
So weird.
Right? Because Gage Workman is on the 40-man already because he was a Rule 5 draft. So he's on the 40-man. Obviously, he has to be on the active roster the whole season. But then the question becomes: do these 2 games count towards that rule? Does he need to be on the 26-man roster? Can he be on the taxi squad in that sense? Right? That's still something that I'm not even clear on. But
so we got sort of an explanation for how the Tokyo taxi squad stuff will work. So I'm gonna try to get this right. They take 31 players. but then you can only have 26 of them active for each of the games. Now you could change who's active from like game 1 to game 2, because if something happens, you can, activate somebody else. But you also don't have to put, like, Nico and Shaw would not have to be put on the IL in order to create active spots. And that's sort of like a special rule for these international series, where you're not basically, so a team doesn't get screwed over because, we've got an IL Horner now, which means he's not going to be ready on the 27th because he's not eligible to come off. So that's basically why they do that. So if with him on the 40-man, I'm thinking about Workman. With him on the 40-man, I think you could take him as a part of that taxi squad, and if you had to, you could activate him, I think.
That's my feeling. That's kind of my understanding of it. But I mean, like I said, like it's still kind of confusing. But it'll also depend on Matt Shaw's availability, right? Because if he's not able to go to Japan, like then you mentioned it, John Birdie and Vidal Brujan would take that second and third. Maybe Gage Workman, just if the rule is he has to be on the active roster, maybe he's one of your bench guys in that sense, because you got the other two utility infielders at second and third. So it's going to be an interesting thing to keep track of, and I would assume the Cubs' hope is that they can keep the three of them in the organization for 2 more weeks until obviously domestic opening day, when you do really have to make that decision.
And that's why I kind of think that they will wait on Workman and maybe not take him, or maybe they'll take him as a part of that 31 and only activate him if it's like somebody gets hurt and they just have to. But otherwise, I do think he stays in Arizona too, so that they can wait on that decision a little bit. Because otherwise, like there's Nicky Lopez who's there on a minor league deal.
Yeah, not
I think that's also like, you're getting a couple of rungs deep at that point. That's why I think they're going to try to get by with Brujan and Birdie for those 2 games.
Yeah, the other side of it, and I guess this technically doesn't matter for Tokyo roster projections, is more for once the Cubs like full domestic regular season begins, is that 5th starter spot. We know Justin Steele and Shota Imanaga. We don't. I believe Imanaga's starting that first game in Tokyo. Yes. Justin Steele, right. The assumption is that Steele is that second game.
He'll be game 2,
Yeah. So then you got Tyone and Matthew Boyd obviously are going to be in that rotation. That 5th spot's open. I know you and the rest of the crew down in Arizona reported it over the weekend. Javier Assad won't be ready for domestic opening day, beginning of the season. So you're looking at a few other options. Like Assad maybe had the leg up in that situation, but he's not going to be ready to go. What are your feelings right now on the rotation and where Craig Counsell and company might be leaning for that spot?
I'm kind of inclined to think that he's going to go Jordan Wicks for that 5th spot, because the talk in camp when I was there was they want him to focus on being a starter rather than trying to play the role of maybe swingman, kind of going back and forth. And given that Colin Ray has had the experience of operating both roles, I think that they will put Colin Ray in the bullpen as your sort of like 6th starter / we need somebody for maybe you're piggybacking a start with Jordan Wicks or something. But I think, Wicks is your 5th starter, Ray's in the bullpen. That was kind of the tone of things in camp when I was there. So if I'm projecting that rotation right now, it's Steele, Imanaga, Tyone, Boyd, Wicks.
That's interesting. I mean, besides just the 4 lefties being in the 5-man rotation, but I mean, of course, Jordan Wicks still has options left. I think he has 2 more minor league options left, for more minor league option years. So he could theoretically start the season in AAA, stretched out as a starter, and 1 call away, ready to go if the need arises. But that's curious that I don't know if that's the you said that's your expectation. I don't know if that's like the universal expectation or universal understanding that it might be Wicks, and it's still obviously weeks to go in spring training. Colin Ray may end up being that guy, just being the veteran, being the guy that has covered a lot of innings in the last couple of years, who has pitched under Craig Counsell. But that probably shows that Jordan Wicks, who missed a lot of time due to injury last season, came into camp. If he does get that 5th spot, and even if he doesn't, like the fact that this is still a conversation means that he came into camp, ready to go, ready to hit the ground running, healthy, and is doing good work now that the Cubs are down in Mesa.
Yeah, and that's like the options part of it is important too, because like I said, they're talking very much about Wicks as a starter. So what we might also see is that Wicks goes to AAA, even if he has a strong spring, looks good, looks healthy. He may go to AAA where he can continue to make starts there, and then it's Ray that gets that 5th spot. And then also, like people have pointed out, like Ben Brown is worth consideration too. And you're right, like there is something to be said for, do you want a 5-man rotation with 4 lefties in it? That's that's got to be something that's going to be a factor as well. So yeah, it's very much a toss-up. It's probably something that we don't really know for sure, probably right up until the 27th. But again, going back to what we were saying earlier about the depth, how nice is it that you've got realistically right now, like probably 3 pretty good options for your 5th starter?
Yeah, that's a big deal. I mean, we've talked about the Cubs' depth the last couple of seasons, and last season I felt like we felt really good about the Cubs' depth, and maybe it didn't always feel that the depth was up. And this is more in the bullpen, probably that the depth just didn't feel completely up to par from what we thought going into the season. But I think we can agree. Like, if it feels like depth-wise, the Cubs are in a good spot on the pitching side. I do still think that the top of the rotation is kind of a concern just because they didn't add to that. I feel like they had the opportunity this offseason, and whether it's budget things or big contracts being thrown around that the front office wasn't comfortable giving out, like whatever it is, they're rolling with Justin Steele and Shota Imanaga and Jameson Taillon as their top 3. On your end, any kind of concerns in that sense of the Cubs in a sense, not specifically 100%, but very close to kind of running it back with the same starters in the organization right now, or just on the team?
Yeah, that is. I think that's a fair concern. That's a legit question, because like there were chances to go out and get somebody to bolster the top end of that rotation, but you're going out there with the same top 3 that you had before, and it worked out pretty well last season. But I still think, like, I'm a big fan of Justin Steele. Shota Imanaga was incredibly impressive last season, but do they have like a true ace? I think arguably maybe not quite. And so is that something that over the stretch of a whole season that's going to emerge as a problem? It could. But I'm a believer, especially in that top 2 of Imanaga and Steele, that I don't if anything's going to be the downfall of this team in 2025, I don't think it's going to be that.
Yeah. No, we're all, in the same boat as, like, Justin Steele's proven since basically summer of 2022, like he can be counted on for leading that rotation. He was a Cy Young contender a couple of years ago. Obviously the injuries hurt him last season, but he still had similar numbers to what he put up in 2023. I think it's fair to expect the same out of Justin Steele because he's been so consistent for the last few years. Shota, you like what Shota brings. I think me personally, there's just concern just because, number one, the environment at Wrigley did help these pitchers. I think that's fair to say. And he is more of a fly ball pitcher. So you hope that doesn't have a negative effect this season if the environment, the weather at the ballpark changes in a different direction. But he had the swing and miss. He had the chase. I think we all like what Shota Imanaga brought to the table last year too. Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. Like there's that ballpark factor that can be so unfriendly to hitters sometimes. And, the opposite side of that is it benefits your pitchers in some cases, where sometimes they can end up getting away with stuff to some extent, especially as a fly ball pitcher, where you get some of these hits that get knocked down by the wind and they get away with something. But that was such the talk last season with Jed was about the weather, especially toward the end of the season, where he felt like it was one of the most unfriendly weather seasons they've had in a long time. And he was still talking about that at Cubs convention in January,
Yeah, I mean that's one of those things that like you can only plan for it to an extent. You trust the guys that you have. So yeah, we'll see.
Yeah. So that's a good segue into kind of what we're expecting for the season. Like what's fair to expect out of the Cubs this season, whether that's individual players, whether that's the team as a whole. What are you going into 2025? What kind of expectations are you setting?
I think it's really reasonable to expect that this is a team that's legitimately going to contend for the division, in part because I just don't think the division is as strong as it was a year ago or 2 years ago. But also because the Cubs, to me, are a better baseball team than what they've been the last 2 years. They've addressed the depth issues like we talked about. So realistically, yeah, you're contending for the division. Maybe you don't win it, but you're much more in the conversation for the wild card spot than you were last year, especially. But I think going from 83 wins to about 88, that's kind of where I'm comfortable right now. I think that's pretty realistic. So I'll go ahead and mark me down for 88 wins and a division title. Why not?
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I mean, you're just adding Kyle Tucker to the mix alone feels like it should boost them up a couple wins. Obviously provided health is there, because I think you can give a guy like that the benefit of the doubt that he'll produce the star numbers because he's done it for years on end now. It's just going to come down to him being able to stay healthy, is what I'd say. Some of the guys in the bullpen, the back end of the bullpen especially, should help, especially with Porter Hodge now too. Getting into his second year in the big leagues, like more experience in the late innings and high leverage innings. I feel good about this roster, and that beyond just what the rest of the division looks like, because it feels like a lot of those teams are either taking a step back or just don't feel necessarily like they should contend with the Cubs, at least for the going into the season. I do feel good about what the Cubs have on paper and what they've put together going into 2025. I think 88 wins right there is a very fair prediction for what the Cubs can do. But I think on the individual sense, like, what should we expect out of a guy like Pete Crow-Armstrong or a guy like Matt Shaw? Young guys with what we feel like are high ceilings, but still obviously some question marks. PCA got most of a full year last year at the big leagues, but struggled for a lot of it until those last couple of months came around and he started figuring things out. Matt Shaw, like, as we know, has never played a regular season Major League Baseball game. Like, what's fair to expect from these young guys in a season when the Cubs are going to need them to compete?
Yeah, I think I'll start with Matt Shaw, because I think the important thing with him is that we really temper those expectations. I think he's going to be a positive WAR player. But you're going to see a lot of ups and downs, especially at the plate, given that he is coming in with 0 major league at bats. Because at least last year, Pete Crow-Armstrong had those at bats the previous September. He struggled, but I think having had that and gone through that, then that helped him last year, which is only going to help him more now in 2025. So I'm feeling pretty good about the consistency at the plate that you'll see from PCA, but it's Shaw that you're going to have to ride those ups and downs.
I agree. When you go with PCA, Pete Crow-Armstrong, like last season, he did eventually figure things out. I think it's fair to believe he can bring that stuff into, and back into the start of this season. There was the struggles for a long time, for 3 months about when he came up, and at the end of April, towards the end of July, he added that leg kick. And while that did help things, I think a lot of it that he'll talk about, that I've talked to him about, and I think we've all heard him talk about, is that a lot of it had to do with developing a routine at the major league level, figuring out how to be a Major League Baseball player. Like, a routine is so big for major league guys, because the season is so long. There's so many games. There's games every day. Like, you have to have that routine to be kind of at your best on a daily basis. And I think on top of adding the leg kick, like kind of changing some mechanics of the swing, really helped Pete Crow-Armstrong to turn into a major league hitter. And you saw it towards the end of the season. I I don't think you should like say he's 100% going to bring that into this season. I think that's still something he's got to prove that he can keep that going into a new year and do that across a full year. We've seen the lows that Pete Armstrong as a hitter can go through, and the goal obviously this season is to make sure those lows don't go so low or last so long. Like even he's probably going to go through some struggles. He's still a young hitter. He's still early on in his career, but the goal is to be just more consistent across the year. Ride those highs obviously, but like if you go through those low patches, don't let them last so long and don't let them get so low. So that's the whole thing for PCA. But I think it's fair to say like he can totally bring that what he did in the second half of last season or the last 2 months and bring that back into 2025 and kind of hit the ground running. I think it's fair to say that could happen. But Shaw, kind of like you said, the Cubs may be in the same position that they were with Pete last year, and we're kind of riding a little bit of the wave of a young hitter getting used to the big leagues. Like I think we believe in Matt Shaw's bat. There's confidence coming out of spring training, coming out of camp, that he's kind of getting that third base position down, and he's starting to figure things out, and he could be an actual, serviceable everyday third baseman over there. The bat is going to be a question that we ask probably throughout the season is just how does he kind of transform, or how does he adapt to what the major leaguers are throwing to him? Because it's going to be a lot harder. It's going to be the hardest pitching he's ever faced in his career. And that's going to be the question is how does he get into it and hit at that level?
Yeah. And I think that's another fair point too, that you brought up, and that people on the outside looking in don't necessarily think about. And that's the development of a routine and how much that does for a player, and how long that can take for a young player to really feel like they've figured out. And that involves a lot of things that we don't think about. I had some conversations with players when I was down in Mesa just about it's little stuff. Like the first road trip that they go on, they're, these young guys are like, where do I sit on the bus? What am I supposed to do, with this? Or like, what time am I supposed to be there to get a bus to the ballpark? Little stuff that like, if in any one of us in our job, if you're, not sure how to get there on time or where you're supposed to go for something, like that impacts you when you perform. So it just makes sense to, for young players. So those are things too that like you need your first few months of the season under your belt to start to feel comfortable with some of that stuff. And I had guys tell me that, in some cases it took them a couple of years before they really felt like they had all that figured out. So yeah, with PCA, I think that the lows won't be quite so low, or he'll snap out of them more quickly. But yeah, I think Cubs fans should be prepared be patient with Shaw.
Yeah.
He's a good player, but we might have to be patient. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, he's got the ceiling of like, he could win Rookie of the Year next year for sure. Like there's no doubting that that's a possibility, but there's also a possibility that he really struggles. And the Cubs have to figure out third base in season, whether that is one of these other utility guys or not. There's a wide range of possibilities for Matt Shaw, but as there is with any prospect that comes up, the jump from AAA to major leagues is huge. And, there's no guarantee that Matt Shaw is the, I don't know the term, the exception to the rule, right? Like there's no guarantee that he comes up and has immediate success. I think that's something that we're going to be looking out for. But all right, Jared, thank you so much for hopping in to Addison to 35th, our new podcast. This is the first Cubs-centric episode. We're still getting things rolling, but I appreciate you for being my first guest on the Addison to 35th podcast.
Ryan, I'm honored. Loved it. Happy to come back anytime.
Yeah, obviously it's on Twitter or X, you're at JWyllys7, and those are Y's instead of I's. Anything else you want to plug? Obviously, we can find your stuff at CHGO, allchgo.com. You're on the CHGO podcast, Cubs and Sox. Anything else you'd like to plug before we head out?
Oh, no, that's it. Just, come find me on X or Twitter or whatever. I love to interact with people there, and just, as I write stuff throughout the season, I love to interact with people in that way too.
All right, Jared, thank you for hopping in. This has been the Addison to 35th podcast, the second episode, first Cubs-focused episode. We'll talk to you all later. Thanks.